This shows how dedicated I am. I am willing to stick videos of me on the internet, okay, of me standing here. Okay, all right. So today we're going to talk about listening, all right? Everybody understands that word, right? Okay, right? Why are we talking about listening? This is a public speaking class, okay? It's not a public listening class. It's a public speaking class. Why do we care about listening? If no one listens, what's the point of a speech? Anybody have any questions? Okay, all right. Let's use some tired sports metaphors, okay? If you're a quarterback and you don't study defensive setups, what happens? Interceptions, sacks. So as a good quarterback, running back, even an offensive lineman, you have to understand defensive setups to be a good offensive player, correct? What end of the court do you play on in basketball? Both, okay? And if you're a pitcher and you don't practice batting, what happens?
You don't know where to put the ball.
Well, if you're playing in the American League, nothing happens because they have the designated hitter rule, which we all can agree is an abomination, all right? Am I right? Sandy Koufax didn't need a designated hitter. Bob Gibson didn't need it. Satchel Paige, Phil Niekro, 24 years in the major leagues, batting average of 196 lifetime. But that's not what we're talking about, okay? You have to understand listeners, okay? And I've quoted Aristotle more than once in here already, right? Telling you, and I've told you that there is nothing I'm teaching you in this class that pretty much hasn't been taught for about 2,000 years. Aristotle in the Rhetoric in 350 BC. Rhetoric falls into three divisions, determined by three classes of listeners to speeches. First of the three elements in speech making, speaker, subject, and person addressed, is the last one, the hearer, that determines the speech's ends and object. The hearer must be either a judge with a decision to make about things past or future, or an observer. A member of the assembly decides about future events, a juryman about past events, while those who merely decide on the order skills are observers. Okay? Of the three elements in speech making, speaker, subject, and person addressed, it is the last one, the hearer, that determines the speech's ends. Okay? So this is not a new concept. A couple of definitions. Dictionary.com. Listening. To give attention with the ear. Attend closely to the purpose of hearing. To pay attention. To heed, obey. Merriam-Webster. To pay attention to sound. To hear something with thoughtful attention. In the Oxford English Dictionary, my favorite, to take notice of an act on what someone says, respond to an advice or request, or the North American derivative, listen up, used to urge someone to pay attention to what is going on. What's the one common word that showed up in all three of those definitions? Hearing. But how do you hear? Well, it's not just hearing, but understanding. The one word that appears in all the definitions is attention. Okay? So let's start off by differentiating between hearing or listening. Okay? How many of y'all are parents? How many of y'all have had parents? Okay. The three people that didn't raise their hands, please speak to me after class, because I don't believe you're actually listening. Okay. What's the one thing? Well, I used to hear this all the time from my mom, especially when she would use my whole full name, Victor Lee McInnes. She always knew you were in trouble then. She would always say, we'd be in the room, and she'd be telling me what for, and then out of the middle of nowhere, the first, I would be sitting there going, and then all of a sudden she would say, "Are you listening to me?" And I would go, "Well, of course, I'm standing 3 feet from you." And she would go, "Fine, what was the last thing I said?" "You were telling me that I don't pay enough attention in school and that I should put more effort into my education." Which was a pretty good guess, to be honest with you. But in many cases was not the one. That was my default guess. Okay? Hearing is a passive process. Listening is active. Okay, we've talked in here before about how sound is generated and how we as humans communicate vocally by sounds. We compress air in our lungs, we send them through our larynx, it gets modulated through our mouths, and then we compress air waves, and those go out. They're caught by the outer ear, they go to the tympanic membrane, okay? Then they hit those little bones in there and all that stuff, okay? Everybody remember all of that? Vaguely, okay? All right. Hearing is that physiological process where sound hits the physiology of your ear and your inner ear. Okay? It is accidental. All right? It is involuntary. And it takes no effort whatsoever. All right, does everybody get what hearing is? Okay, my youngest daughter and I are hardcore extroverts, classic extroverts. Okay, the difference, my wife and my oldest daughter are classic introverts. Now, a classic extrovert is someone who has to speak something, to hear something verbalized, or they don't actually, it's not like what we think of as somebody who's really great at a party. Okay, a classic extrovert has to hear their thoughts verbalized, or they don't think in order to process them. An introvert does all that internally, which makes for some really interesting conversations between me and my wife. But my youngest daughter is even more of a classic extrovert than I am. There was a time when she was about 13 or 14 years old when we're driving down the road and I looked over at her and she'd been talking. I'd had, things were going on at work. Traffic was horrible. And I just looked over at her and I said, sweetheart, I have no idea what you're talking about because I haven't been listening for about the last 5 minutes. Okay? And she said, well, that's okay. And she just kept right on going. Okay? That she was just verbalizing her thoughts. But I was hearing her because we were in the cab of my pickup truck. All right? The sound waves were hitting me, but I wasn't listening. Okay? Listening is focused. It's engaged. And it is done with intent. Okay? Everybody now get the difference between hearing and listening. So when you're a public speaker, what are you striving for from your audience? Do you want them to hear you? You want to be heard. You certainly, and again, if you go back to when we talked about, picking your topic, one of the things you look at is the occasion and where you're going to be speaking and the environment you're going to be speaking. You want to make sure they can hear you, but you want to push them to where they're listening to you, to where they're willing to exert that effort so that they enter into that active process. Questions? Okay. So we want to talk about a guy named Blaine Goss. Blaine Goss teaches at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. And in 2009, he came up with this radical concept that is sort of a 21st century model that said that listening is information processing. I want you to think about that for a second. So Goss has taken hearing and listening and broke them completely into two separate pieces. Okay, hearing is the physiological piece. Listening is information processing. Okay? And he broke it down into three overlapping segments. I know you guys are really digging on my artistic skills here. Okay? This first step he called signal processing. Okay? Anybody here ever do any work with radios?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you have. Okay. A lot of times when you're working in a communications environment, you talk about the signal to noise ratio. Okay, we're going to talk about that more in a minute. So, signal processing, or in this case, signal processing, okay, is where you break things down into segments and you begin to apply structures. Okay? How many of y'all have ever lived overseas where you were among people who didn't speak English hardly ever? Okay? Noah, where were you at, if you don't mind saying? Lithuania. Okay? How long were you there for? What happened when you heard someone speaking English? Yeah, it was like, okay? Yeah. Even when we spent 5 years in the UK, even when you heard an American accent, it didn't make any, you didn't have to understand words. Okay? All you had to hear was the segments and the structures that you were familiar with. And it was, okay, there's someone who I can speak to easily. Okay? So in the signal processing segment, you're beginning to apply structures. You're beginning to break things down into segments. Okay? Things stop becoming just noise and random sounds to where it starts to become language and sentences. The next is going to be literal processing. In literal processing, this is where you begin to apply meaning and some more simple implications. And by simple implications, we would say, you could use an example of non-contextualized definitions of words. Okay? For example, everybody in here is familiar with the South. If you heard somebody say, oh, well, bless their heart. Okay, what does that mean? That means they are not the brightest bulb on the Christmas tree this year. I think we can all agree on that point. But in literal processing, you're only beginning to assign that. Now you're more looking at the literal implications, the simple implications of the words. The last part, the last segment, is reflexive processing. Okay? Or reflective processing. Now, in reflective processing, you're doing critical analysis. And this is where you begin to appreciate. Now, appreciate doesn't necessarily mean a positive thing. It means you begin to make the decision about how you're going to engage with that. Okay? Does everybody understand all the steps that Goss was putting out here? Okay. This is a radical shift in the way communications academics began to think about listening. Okay? Because now we're looking at it as an iterative process, and we've discussed iterative processes before, processes that build on themselves. Okay? And if you go back, remember the very first day of lectures when we talked about encoding and decoding messages? Okay? and here's your sender, and they've got M1, and even the encoding that into language changes that. And when you get to the receiver, they're going to decode it, and you wind up at M3, which may be a different message than what the sender intended to send. Everybody remember that? Okay? So this breaks down what's going on in here that gets you from M2 to M3, the third iteration of the message. Okay? I'm getting a lot of earnest stares, but I'm not getting any questions. I know you're listening. I can tell. I'm getting that feedback. Okay, but what questions do you have at this point?
So you said appreciating, or when you appreciate in the last process, it's when you're deciding on whether you're going to like respond to that person talking to you?
Well, it's not whether or not you're going to decide whether or not to respond. Appreciate is Goss's term. I would probably put more evaluate, as in you're beginning to assign a good or a positive or negative inference to what they're saying. Okay, because you have to, do the signal processing. You have to look at the literal meanings, and then you begin to reflect on what's been said. Okay, and you begin to break that down. Can't decide if you guys are going like, wow, that's really deep and I'm really into this, or it's just like, I have no idea what the hell he's talking about at this point. Somebody doesn't say anything, well, I'm going to have a sip of coffee to give you time to get your thoughts together.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a hard time to really listen when I have to. That's a kind of obligation listen. Like when you're watching the video, I don't know exactly where to focus to get exactly what they want to tell me, and what I should do to get the key points of this, whatever I'm watching and listening, and not only for blah blah blah, but I specific on this class. We're watching the video. What should I look to really listen this thing?
Okay, so let me see if I understand your question. Your question is, you're having, when we watch a speech critically, like we did today, you're having difficulties figuring out where you need to engage and how you need to engage that artifact, so that you get the critical analysis you need. Okay, that was me restating your questions with a bunch of master level words so that I can prove that, I went to graduate school for a reason. That's fine. Okay, that's one of the points of this class, is to move you from just a passive consumer of speech to a more critical analyst of speech. Okay? And that's why we take the first step of learning how to be a good critic of something is how to actually do it. Okay, and right now we're sort of moving through that process of learning how to give good public speeches. So when you see other public speeches, you can begin to do critical analysis. Does that make sense? Okay, it's a process. Okay. I mean, we are so now, and this is my personal opinion, now we are so taught to be passive consumers of media, okay, that none of us really, unless we put forth a lot of effort, actually get into critical analysis. Okay, so that's part and parcel, and it's very difficult to say, well, that was a good speech. Well, why do you say that? Well, because I liked it. That was a bad speech. Well, why was that? Well, because I didn't like it. So now we're giving you a broader vocabulary with which to express why you liked or didn't like a speech, and that's part of the process you're in right now. The end goal of this will be, after you take your final exam and you go home and you watch some politician give a speech, you go, oh, that's just complete hooey. Look at the 3 things he didn't do. Okay? Does that make sense? So I appreciate your desire. Where you're learning how, and I've talked to you, and I know that you're getting there. Okay, be patient. Let's have that conversation in 5 weeks. Okay, All right? And you're dealing with language issues too because your native language is Portuguese, and that's a whole different. I should have asked you. You would have been the immediate go-to person. Have you ever heard anybody in Aiken speaking in Portuguese? That probably got your attention to me. No, she's never had. Okay, now I feel bad about bringing it up. Okay? Okay, so does anybody have any question about Goss's model that listening is information processing? Okay, and this is something that, people probably would not have even been able to comprehend even as late as the 1980s or 1990s. Okay? I mean, we have to become very familiar with information processing and how computers work and a whole bunch of other things for this model to even begin to work. Okay? But what you're looking for as a speaker is engagement at that level. Okay? And how do we know when we've reached reflexive processing? How do we know the audience is there?
What their face looks like.
Facial expressions? Feedback. Because remember, I've said about 100 times in here that public speaking is not a one-way communication. It is a dialogue. Now, the audience is part of the dialogue, maybe nonverbal. But remember, you should be looking, and when you start talking, when you give your attention device at the beginning of your speech, okay, you should see people go, okay? And they've entered signal processing. Okay? And then as you continue to talk, you hear them begin to look at you, and they're going, like the look I was getting a couple of minutes ago. Well, yeah. And then you get the, oh yeah, I understand that, yeah. Or you may even get, no, I don't agree with you on that point. But at least they're in critical analysis, and they're in the appreciative stage there. Ms. Beeler, you have that look on your face I was just talking about where you're going,
No.
Okay, all right. If there's no questions about Goss's model, we're going to move to the more, and I always put Goss up front because I shock you with that. Because again, while I quote Aristotle from 235 BC, or 350 BC, I also quote Blaine Goss from 2009. That's how dynamic I am, okay? All right. Let's talk about the 5 stages of listening. This is very traditional. Okay? First stage. Before E, except after C. Receiving. Where do you think receiving happens physiologically? The ear as a whole, both your inner and outer ear. It takes place, receiving happens in the ear. It's where we begin to sort out signal from noise. Okay, I was talking about signal noise ratio a minute ago. How many of y'all have ever been to, trying to think, how many of y'all have ever been to a really loud concert? Okay? Where they're just blasting. Right? I'm trying to think of a concert I've been to that was really loud, and it would go back to mentioning bands that you guys had never even possibly heard of. What? Oh, wait, well, hold on a second. I went to too many. What did you say? Yeah, okay. All right. That's why he's sitting in the back corner today, so he thinks he's isolated. Okay? All right. Have you ever been to a concert where it's just like, and then all of a sudden somebody leans over to you and says something, okay? And they're talking to you, but you got no idea what they're talking about. So what do you do? What? Exactly, you go, what? And you turn your head and you lean in. And even though they aren't talking any louder, over that massive amount of noise, you can hear them and understand them. Okay? How many of y'all have experienced that? Okay? How many of y'all have been to a football game like it, and I don't talk about the NFL, you guys know that, but like at Death Valley or at Jordan-Hare Stadium, 87,000 people, Knoxville where they have 101,000 people. How many of y'all have ever been to a football game? Or my favorite, Davis Wade Stadium at Starkville, Mississippi, where they have 67,000 people with cowbells. Okay? All right? How does the quarterback communicate, when they're running the shotgun, how does the quarterback communicate with the center as to when to snap the ball? Well, there's nonverbal signals, but also now what you're seeing more and more is okay? That is not a noise that is down there in the center of the field. The hand clap is a unique noise that when we receive it, we would note as being different from the ambient noise around us. Suddenly you've gotten a signal. Okay? So everybody understands the difference between signal and noise? Okay? So receiving is where we begin to isolate the signal from the noise. Okay? Then we begin to interpret. Oh, wait a minute. Let me stick consistently. I picked one model. Next we hit understanding. You go through 14 different textbooks. The same 5 steps are always there. It's just they're labeled differently, and sometimes I forget which labels I picked. Okay, understanding involves interpretation. Okay? And it also understands meaning, or application of meaning. Okay, now we're beginning to apply processes. This isn't physiological. Now we're transitioning to where we're beginning to listen to the message. Okay? There's a lot of studies out there. The third step is remembering. There's a lot of studies that say we can't even begin to act on information until we remember it. Now, that remembering can take place in a microsecond. It's really fast as we process what we hear and what we understand into our short-term memory. Okay? But the next step is remembering, and this is based totally on what we define as listening. If you are not actively engaged in the process, if you are not actively listening, you'll never remember. Okay? And again, we've all been involved in conversations, and I have been in here, and I've looked at you guys, and I say, okay, what did we say about this? Something I referred to about 3 minutes ago, and I get like 20 people going like, okay, we never made that bridge from understanding to remembering. All right? I've been married 27 years. I get stuck here a lot, apparently, at least according to my wife. Okay, I told you this yesterday. I don't think you did. I did, at which point I usually go, yeah, all right. Yeah, you probably did. Okay? The next step is exactly what it sounds like. The evaluation of what we've been listening to. And again, remember, I do European sirens much better than I do American sirens, because in a European siren is, nee-naw, nee-naw, everybody, okay? I receive that. Now finally I get the 4 guys in the back engaged with the European siren noise.
That's my favorite siren to play when I'm driving.
I'm sorry. We're going to have to take a break for a minute on that one. So you're like sitting there in the firehouse at night and you hear the little like they do on Chicago Fire, and you go, great, I get to do the nee-naw sound. Thank you for your service. Okay? All right. So if I'm hearing that nee-naw coming up behind me, apparently they also do that in Aiken County, not just in France. I receive that. I understand it, okay, as an emergency vehicle. I process it really quickly, okay, and I remember, oh yeah, that's an emergency vehicle coming up behind me, so I have to respond. And how do I respond? Yeah, you pull over so the ambulance can come by you, and then you swing in. You say, I got every red light between here and the hospital. Okay? All right? And this responding in most environments is where we give feedback. Okay? So you can really tell, again, if your audience is making it all the way through the listening process, if you're getting feedback. If you see them engaging with you, either verbally or non-verbally. Some speaking environments are going to allow you to engage verbally. Some not so much. Okay? Everybody understand? Now, does this in any way contradict Goss's model of listening as information processing? No, it does not. This is a much more classic, physiological focused, in my opinion, process. But again, this is relatively new because all that research that said we have to remember something before we can process it and evaluate it. Used to be that psychologists thought, man, it hit you when you could process it. They didn't understand how memory was involved in almost every step of the process. Okay? And that's why when we have traumatic brain injuries now, the first thing we begin to rebuild is the memory processes. Not the physiological processes like used to be. Okay? All right? So let's talk about the fact that not all listeners are the same. Okay, there are 4 listening styles. The first is people focused. Okay? That means that the listener is focused on the speaker as an individual. Okay? Remember, we jump back to Aristotle and we talk about pathos, logos, and ethos. Okay, and ethos being the credibility of the speaker, determines how persuasive they will be. Okay, people focused are heavily into that ethos. They're focused on the speaker. Okay. Action focused is focused on the speaker's motivations. Okay? If we go back to that, pathos, logos, ethos, these are the guys that are involved in the emotional side. They want to know why the speaker's saying it. They're heavily into the pathos part of that model. Okay? The next is content focused. They want to listen to the details of what you're saying. Does the message make sense to them? This is logos. People are interested in the logical argument. Okay? And then one thing that Aristotle probably didn't have to deal with 2,300 years ago was time focused. You know when I become very time focused? When I'm buying a new car. Okay? Because I research cars before I go buy them. And the salesman is sitting there going, yeah, this thing's got my Chevy Colorado truck out there. Hey, it's got the 4-cylinder diesel engine with twin turbos. I'm going like, yeah, I know. How much is it going to cost? Get to the point. I'm focused on getting this through as quickly as possible. I'm not trying to, be impatient. I just want to understand what you're talking about as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Okay? Again, back in Greece in 350 BC, they probably didn't have a whole lot to do. They weren't too worried about time. They were worried, okay, about, remember, ethos, pathos, and logos. People focused, they're worried about the individual speaker. Action focused, they're worried about the emotions or the motivation of the speaker. And then content focused, how logical are the speaker's arguments. So when you're walking in, how do you know who's who? If I'm walking into a public speaking environment, how do I know how many people-focused, action-focused, content-focused, and time-focused people I have? What? Feedback. Okay? Because you will see people when you walk in and begin, as we talk about our introductions, your attention device, okay? You go through, you state your purpose, you give your preview, and then you give your credentials. You will see people react to different points. Because when you stand up here and when you do this often enough and you say, you may be asking yourself, why am I here talking to you about the fish populations in Clark Hill Reservoir? What makes me an expert on this? You will see people go, oh yeah, that's what I'm, and you'll go, oh wow, he's people focused. Okay? Why does that make you guys, the things you laugh at, I just have no understanding.
Did you research?
What?
Did you research?
I did, in depth.
Yeah, we can tell.
I have told y'all on multiple occasions, I'm just making examples up on the fly while I'm standing up here. Okay? That's why when I develop my exam, I go by my lecture notes because no telling what I actually said while I was standing up there. Okay. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So let's make a model, a listening model. Okay? Get a couple of markers. Here's that. Okay? This is your speaker. Okay? Okay. Boss is gone. Get crazy. Okay. This is the speaker. Sound waves. Listener. Okay? This, of course, is the international symbol for a dump truck.
Ring of garbage.
Fine, it's a garbage truck. God. We all know that garbage trucks are loud. So is the listener going to be able to hear the speaker?
Well, maybe.
Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the level of that noise. Okay? If a garbage truck pulled up right out here and started to, garbage truck comes by my house 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Picks up the recycling. I am getting less and less committed to the environment every single Tuesday morning. Okay, 6 o'clock in the morning. Okay, if that happened right out there, would you guys be able to, what would happen?
We would all turn and look.
Everybody would turn and look. I mean, you guys turn and look when there's the least bit of thunder. Everybody goes, oh, I've never heard that sound before. I wonder what's going on out there. Okay? So one of our impediments to listening is noise. There is physical noise. Psychological noise. Okay? There is physiological noise. And then there is what we call semantic noise. Okay? Physical noise. Something that just interrupts the compression of the airwaves between the speaker and the listener. Okay? That rock concert. God, did I just sound like the oldest guy on the planet? That rock concert. that head-banging music you youth listen to. Okay? that physical noise, something that interrupts those, I mean, it can be so loud, all right, that those compressions, compressed airwaves coming off whatever it is, okay, just overwhelms. Anybody who's flown on a military aircraft, the funniest thing is, I watch SEAL Team. I like that show. It is in no way realistic to what's going on in the real world. But one of the things that always really pisses me off about that show is they're flying on a C-17, which is the big gray cargo plane, and they're standing 4 feet from each other going, yeah, so how do you think the mission went? And they're going like, I think it did pretty good, but hey, have you seen that hot girl up there? We need to go talk. You know, seriously, those are the conversations these guys have. Okay? Now, I have flown on a C-17 on multiple occasions, and when you talk on a C-17, you get right next to the person, you cup your hands, and you scream as loud as you can, and then they turn to you and look at you and go, what? Okay? That noise is so overwhelming, you just can't physically communicate verbally. Okay? You've been there and you have done that. Same thing when they're riding with the doors open on a Huey helicopter, the old Vietnam era helicopter. You can't scream over those rotor blades. It's just not humanly possible. Psychological noise is anything internally to you that will prohibit you from listening. Okay, everybody knows what a trigger word is? Okay, where you say something that's going to get an immediate psychological reaction that's going to preclude communication. Okay? I have a trigger phrase, right-thinking Americans. As soon as I hear somebody say that, Why? Why does that make you, again?
Because it's a meme.
Yeah, it is. I understand that. Yeah. Yeah, everybody understand the concept of a cousin-in-law?
Yeah.
That's somebody you have to talk to at family events, but you want to make sure everybody knows that you don't share any DNA with them. Okay? Yeah, he used to use the phrase right-thinking American all the time, and that's a different story. But as soon as he started talking about right-thinking Americans, I started thinking about Oreos. Oh, what I'd be saying, Oreos. I like Oreos a lot. Okay? That's my cousin-in-law, Bobby. All you need to know about him was one Sunday morning he was cleaning his 45 and drinking Jack Daniels. Anybody want to guess where that story wound up at? Anyway, that's completely... See, now that Stacy's gone, I can just talk about whatever the hell I want to. Okay? All right. Physiological noise. These are things internal to your body. The most obvious one is that you have difficulty hearing. Okay? For most people that have been in the military, we've gotten a lot of higher range stuff that's just gone. Okay? But also, how many of y'all have ever been really listening to, something very intently, and your stomach goes, whoa, and you're suddenly going, I haven't eaten anything in 7 hours. So suddenly you're out. You're not listening to, what you're thinking of is Oreos. I like Oreos. Okay? Or if you went to Taco Tuesday and, that dodgy little place down the street and you go, whoa, you're going like, he's got like 18 minutes, then I'm out of here. Okay, it's 10:34. This is over at 11. 26 minutes. I'm good. Okay? Are you listening? No, you're not. And then semantic interference is language issues. Okay? Where you just don't understand the language that's being used. All right? Then we've talked about the fact that my wife is from Vermont. The first time she saw me walk up to an old friend and say, hey, how's your mom and him? And they went, fine, how's yours? Like, good. Okay? After we walked off, she was going like, what the hell did you just say to that guy? How's your mom and him? I don't understand. That's a semantic problem. Okay? And again, you don't speak English as your primary language. Noah was in Lithuania. I've been in multiple countries where people did not speak English as their primary language. Okay? I spoke some French. I speak a little German. I speak some Arabic so I can get by. But when people start, there's always that, any of y'all, what do they speak in Lithuania? Do they speak Lithuanian? Have they started speaking Lithuanian again, or are they still speaking Russian?
They do have Russian speakers, but most of it is either going to be Lithuanian or Latvian, which is like the Baltic language.
Yeah. So the really hard part is when you get a little comfortable with the language. Like we spent 2 weeks in France, and I thought I was getting pretty good with French. So I started trying to converse in French, and they said, "Oh, this guy speaks French," and I'm like, "Okay, no, shit, we've reached it." Okay, all right. Other impediments. So there's noise. All right. The next thing is, so we have noise. We have receiver biases. The biggest one you hear talked about today is confirmation bias. Anybody know what confirmation bias is?
Whether you agree or don't agree.
Yeah, you will listen to and you will hear and you will process things that you already agree with. But when somebody presents information to you that you do not agree with, you're going to discount it and not hear it or not listen to it. Okay? And again, if you want confirmation bias, a good example of confirmation bias, watch the Fox News channel or MSNBC. Because both of those are very heavily oriented toward a particular point of view. Okay? Another receiver bias. If I walked up in front of a group and I said, hey, and if Vic McKinnon stood up here and said, hey, today I'm here to talk to you about the problems facing African American women in the early part of the 21st century. Okay? What's the reaction going to be?
You're old white dude.
What?
You're old white dude.
I'm an old white dude. Simple enough. I would, like to say that's not the case. Okay? But people, when I step up here, are going to have expectations. And they are going to reasonably be able to say, what do you know truly about what's going on with African American women at this point in time? And I, am going to have to be able to answer that. Okay? Somebody gets up, and one of the things that used to happen all the time when I was going to Auburn, somebody would say, one of our professors who had his degrees from the University of Alabama would stand up wearing an Alabama t-shirt or shirt. Yeah, we would just, give him, harass him because that was all we knew about the guy. Okay? Another one. A couple of weekends ago, I went to the Southern Collegiate Leadership Conference with the Student Leadership Council here from Macon Technical College. I went to one of the seminars was music and social justice. And the moderator started off with showing us 6 videos of people that were dealing with social injustice through music. Started with Bob Marley. Went through, had a video from Tupac, did not have any NWA, which I was kind of surprised by, but then again I talked to her about it and okay, that made sense. Had Childish Gambino, had 5 or 6 videos. And then we started a conversation and a discussion, and I began to, I finally just sat there and they were talking about all these male artists now that are involved in the social justice movement. And I kept listening, and we were about 20 minutes into the conversation, and I said, okay, I raised my hand, and the moderator recognized me, and I said, okay, I realize I'm the demographic outlier in this group. I'm the oldest person in the room. But when I was growing up, the social justice, music in social justice was being fronted and led by Aretha Franklin, Janis Joplin, Gladys Knight, Joan Baez. It was women's voices were being heard. I haven't heard anybody mention any women so far. And there was this long pause because it was the old white dude that's asking this question. Okay, and people were just, and finally the moderator jumps in and starts the conversation. And then somebody sits here and says, well, Lady Gaga does a lot of social justice. There's a lot of social justice issues addressed in her music. And I went, yeah, I know, I'm a huge Lady Gaga fan. At which point 30 people in this room go, huh? Okay, the fact that I'm a big Lady Gaga fan really caught people off guard because of their biases toward me. Okay? Because I'm supposed to say things like rock concerts and things like that. Okay? There's attention spans. there is very little documented evidence on this, but the notion is generally accepted that our attention spans are shrinking fantastically. Okay? Yes, I just turned the projector on. Okay. Because there's no video for this, so I'm not lowering the screen, but I do want you guys to hear this. I want you to listen to this. You should recognize this speech.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Okay, you know, we clearly, obviously do not have a contemporary copy of Abraham Lincoln giving that address. It usually runs, when you hear it, usually the delivery runs between 2.5 to 3 minutes. Okay? It is probably the perfect political speech. Okay? The language is perfect. You know, he puts it in very almost archaic terms, or arcane terms. You know, fourscore and 7 years ago. Why didn't he just say 87 years? Okay? Our forefathers brought forth on this nation. 87 years ago, the founding fathers created a country. Why didn't he say it that way? He didn't. He used very high, elevated language. And again, you hear people like Sam Waterston and Jeff Daniels and people like that do it. Anybody know historically how that speech was received? It was hated. It was, the Chicago Times said, "The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to the intelligent foreigner as the President of the United States." The London Times said the ceremony at Gettysburg was rendered ludicrous by some of the luckless sallies of that poor President Lincoln. Okay? It did not meet what people expected of in the day. Okay? And Lincoln was kind of a late add-on, and everybody knows the story that he actually he took the train from Washington to Gettysburg, and he wrote the address on the back of an envelope. He did not speak from the back of an envelope. He then refined it and put it on paper. But the myth is that he wrote it on the back of an envelope. The actual keynote address was delivered by a guy named Edward Everett, and it started like this. "Standing beneath this serene sky, overlooking these broad fields, now reposing from the labors of the waning year, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, It is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the elegant silence of God and nature, but the duty to which you have called me must be performed. Grant me, I pray you, your indulgence and your sympathy. It then went on for 13,000 words like that. His speech lasted 2.5 hours. It was considered a model of public oratory. Okay? Because you got to remember, in 1864, when they were dedicating that cemetery, what else did you have to do? Go home and watch the crops die? I mean, you know, you can watch the cows lowing in the field for so long before you begin to get bored with that. So you would go, and your expectation was that if a politician was going to get up and speak, they were going to get up and speak for 2.5 hours. Remember, if you traveled 3 hours, which is about 10 miles, to see President Lincoln speak, and he's up and down in 2.5 minutes, and then you got a 3-hour trip back home, I'm not happy with President Lincoln that afternoon. Okay? But Edward Everett, he gave me my money's worth. Okay? Now, how long are you willing to listen to some politician or any speaker speak? Yeah, we have extreme expectations. A friend of mine's a Methodist preacher, and I was joking around with him, and he said, what do you do with your watch? And he says, I never wear a watch when I'm preaching. It's going like, why? And I said, I'm a Methodist minister. I know at exactly 12 o'clock because I'm going to see people going. Okay, and I know I got to get out. People won't listen to me after 12 o'clock. Okay, look at Donald Trump's speeches. They're just an hour and a half long, strung together, 15-second sound bites. I'm not criticizing the guy. I'm not saying he's a bad politician, he's a bad president. I'm saying that his speeches are 15-second sound bites, strung together. Okay, you can always tell when he's reading something that's longer than that, because he'll see it come up on the teleprompter and he'll go, okay, and then he'll start reading the paragraph. And usually by the time he gets to the end of the paragraph, he's back into his 15-second sound bites, throwing them in as asides. We don't like to hear speeches like that. Okay? So you have to take into account the attention span. Now, I'm stuck here with you guys. Well, no, I have the great privilege of you're stuck with me for about an hour and 20 minutes at a time. So what do I do to keep your attention? I tell stupid jokes. I walk around. If I see that these 4 guys in the back aren't necessarily paying attention, I may walk all the way back. That's just an example. You guys have been paying attention. You're fine. Especially once I did the whole Neon thing. I had everybody involved. Okay? But you have got to watch that. And how are you going to be able to tell when you've reached somebody's attention span limits?
They're not looking at you anymore.
Okay? And what is that called? Feedback. Okay? When you see it, and trust me, at 9 o'clock, 9:35 when this class starts, I got 18 people going. Here it is, 10 to 11. Is there anything wrong with that? No, those people are reacting naturally. That's perfectly okay. What that means is you need to step up whatever you're doing. Now, how do we then shift your attention back to from whatever it is they're engaged in? They're probably sitting there going, Oreos. I like Oreos a lot. Okay? How do you shift them off of that back to what you're talking about?
Talk about the Clark Kent Reservoir.
Not the Clark. Did I say Clark Kent Reservoir?
I don't know.
Okay, it's the Clark Hill Reservoir.
Oh, Clark Hill. I thought it was-
How do you shift people when their attention span is beginning to lag? How do you shift people from whatever they want to think about to what you need them to think about? What? Make a joke? What? An attention device. You may need to regain their attention. Okay? Simplest way to do that is if you sit there and you pause, and we've talked about this over and over again. If you're giving a speech and you pause and you say, okay, now that I've talked about the problem, we're going to talk about the solution. People are going to go, We're done talking about the problem, I guess. Maybe I should hear the solution at this point. Okay? What else are you going to do? Gestures. Make your gestures bigger. I mean, if you've got 18 people going, and their eyes are closed, you got a bigger problem than that. You should have seen that coming back after the third or fourth one went down. Okay? But bigger gestures, if they suddenly see so if you're sitting here talking like this and you're gesturing like this and you're just doing this and suddenly you're doing this, people are going to go, wait a minute, hold on a second, something's changed here. I need to refocus. What else? Inflection, vocal variation. Okay, so now that we've talked about the problem, let's talk about an extended pause. That silence will make people go, oh, wait a minute, something's changed in the environment. Okay, or if you've been talking like this and you suddenly see that everybody's beginning to be lost, okay, you can then, now we're going to talk about the solution. Okay, got it. Okay? You can force them back to you. Okay? Right? Or you can do stupid stuff like, of course, then that's what I do. You may not be comfortable with that. Okay, last thing. So, if I want you to be a critical consumer of speech, let's talk about what you can do to be an active listener. Number one, take notes. And there's about a million reasons why taking notes is a good idea. The obvious thing is it gives you something to look back on. But also, marrying up what you're hearing, what you're seeing with a physical motion, okay, improves your memory. Right? It used to be I got through, okay, I didn't have to put any effort to get through high school. I got through part of my college career and through graduate school because I really had to start studying when I became a junior at Auburn. Everything else, I was happy with a 2.5 grade point average. It was fine. Okay? But what I had to start doing was I would go back and I would look at my notes, and they were usually, so I would go back and rewrite all my notes, and that's how I studied for exams. Because I was marrying up a physical action with an academic idea. Okay? Second thing, minimize distractions. I help you with that by having my no electronics policy. I started that because the first time I came, I hadn't taught outside of a military environment in buildings where you couldn't bring in a cell phone. Okay? And I had two students that were sitting over in those two seats right there, second row. They said, we're going to be taking notes on our laptops. Is that okay? And I'm like, I'm a hip 21st century instructor. Sure, why not? Okay? And then I kept noticing them going, look at this. Okay, and I'm like going, I know they weren't going, hey, look, I just took some really good notes over here. Okay? And so I saw them both looking at one screen, and so I walked to the back of the class. Very casually, and I look over and I look at the screens, and they're both watching YouTube. Okay? And then they were both stunned. I used to give a midterm. They were both stunned when they got 30s out of 100 on the midterm. And I'm like going, put the laptops away. Okay? If you walk into an environment, get your phone out of just get rid of it. Hide it. Turn it off. Because that phone is going to be nothing but a distraction to you. Okay? Last, think critically, but suspend judgment. Okay? Remember we were talking about listener biases? Or receiver biases? Okay? This is where you are aware of your own biases and you suspend judgment. Listen for main ideas. Look at how the audience is reacting and engaging. And then examine quality of reasoning. Now, think critically does not mean think derisively. You're not there to say, oh, this guy sucks. Okay, from square one. What you're there to do is to listen and identify what their main ideas are, and then put them against your own experiences and your own knowledge. Okay? You guys are aware of what President Trump announced yesterday. He's going to issue an executive order basically canceling Section 1 of our Amendment 14 of the U.S. Constitution. Okay? When I hear him say that, critically I know, based on, I listened to the whole thing and, thought he was going to follow up with an amendment to the Constitution or something like that. No, he's just going to write an executive order. My knowledge of how the Constitution works and about how our government works says that's impossible. He doesn't have the authority to do that. Okay? Now, but there are people, and if you look at Facebook today, if you go to the Washington Post, the feed, and look at the comments, there are people that, are not critically listening. They're just accepting. Okay? And again, I got to stop picking on the president, but it's there's no other politician out there right now that's just completely consuming media. I mean, I could talk about Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, but you guys don't live in Georgia. You may not be familiar with them. I could talk about Governor McMaster, but, I'd love to hear that guy speak. I don't know what he says. I'm so in love with what he's saying. That's my that noise is interfering with my ability to be just his voice just lulls me. Okay, what questions have you got?
It's not really, well, okay, I guess it's a question, but when we went to the conference,
Yeah?
the second speaker, I have no idea what he was talking about, or I didn't really comprehend what he was trying
Dr.
to talk
Hader,
about.
which was kind of an interesting name for a guy talking about social justice, but anyway.
But he was talking so quickly, and his visual PowerPoint was very heavily worded. So if a speaker is doing something like that, and I'm trying to pay attention, but I can't, like what else can I do? Because I really have no idea how I was supposed to pay attention to him, because I was falling asleep.
There are, and the person that was speaking was, and this is why we don't do PowerPoint in my classes. I know other SBC 205 sections do PowerPoint. I don't do PowerPoint because his PowerPoint killed his speech. Because he had a 2-hour presentation that he was going to cram into 40 minutes, and he didn't change his PowerPoint. And he also didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. So he would suddenly go, oh, wait, click, 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 click. Then he'd go, wait a minute, and then he'd get 2 points, and he'd go, back up, back up, back up. So it was really, there was nothing you can do in that case. I have a deep background in the stuff that he was talking about, and it was very hard for me to follow. Now, afterwards, I went up and spoke to him, and we had a great conversation. I got to talk to him for about 10 minutes, and it was a great conversation. And he was speaking about social injustice and racial inequality and how we address those issues on campus, and his concerns that we aren't actually addressing them on campus. And he and I had a conversation about, what I've heard of the biggest cop-out is, well, in 50 years, Caucasians aren't going to be the majority. And he's, and he and I had a conversation about redefining the issue of white. Whenever the power structure, those people that are in power get threatened, they just incorporate more people into being white. Like the Irish weren't white until the Italians showed up. And the Italians weren't white until the Poles and the Greeks, and that's just an ongoing conversation. He talked, it was just, I've had trouble following the guy. So sometimes there's nothing you can do. Okay, what else? Sorry, that went off on a little tangent. Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you get a chance, if you want to read something this week, read some of the stuff he's written on race relations in the 21st century. He is brilliant. Okay? All right, no more questions. What's today, Wednesday?
No.
It was Tuesday.
Yeah.
So you guys are back Thursday. I have no idea what we're going to talk about Thursday, but I'm sure it'll be great. What was the other thing we were going to possibly talk about? Oh, problem solution speeches. We'll talk about that on Thursday. So your outlines are due next week, so that'll give you a week to get everything together. We start those on the 8th. Your outlines for problem solution speech will be due next Friday, a week, not 2 days from now or 3 days from now, but a week from then, so that'll give you plenty of time. So problem solutions, question in the back.
I thought it was Thursday.
Is it due Thursday?
On the 8th, right?
I thought the speech was on the 8th.
No, I think you said
Yeah, I
all
think,
problem solution speech outlines due on the 8th.
or doing the 8th, yeah. The 8th of November, which will be a week from Friday. Okay? All right? If I don't see you before then, listen, if you get an apple for trick-or-treating, make sure you check it and don't eat any candy that's already had the wrapper opened up, okay? All right. We'll see y'all on Thursday. Have a good Halloween. Don't get it. I don't want to see your picture in it. You can count your arrest reports, okay?